All right, hello everyone, and welcome to yet another session of the Fourth Generation Initiative, where we are still engaging questions about how we can educate ourselves politically in order to be conscious actors and conscious, heralders of transformation, political transformation in our communities. And I think it's important to start today with the fact that political education is cross-cutting, right? It's not particular to a geographical context. I always reference a speech that I once had a comrade whom we've had before on this call make, in which he said that politics is the alpha of our problems, because the way we organize ourselves politically or political decisions, determine everything that we engage in. I've been following the discussions keenly, for example, in the United States, and conversations about whether or not the country has been forced into the war, with Iran, or on the Iranian people by Israel, or whether, that was a war that their political leaders entered in consciously, right? And you see that discrepancy, for example, between the people's interest in the war. There's actual citizens. If you survey the Americans and you ask them, okay, do you guys want to participate in this war, vis-a-vis what the political class is saying? But to know that they are all a product of those decisions. And I was having this conversation with a friend as well, about how just the expenses of it. You look at the figures that they're quoting. One fighter jet or one bomber is like, that could finance like half of our budget, or at least a quarter, or a whole ministry, for a financial year. But this is, and obviously that's money that would have been appropriated, elsewhere, to assuage, to help the lives of those people. So political decisions are very key. That's just a point to why we must have an interest, right, in politics, that the decisions that our leaders or our representatives make on our behalf, have a very real bearing on the way that we live our lives, and on, the size of our dreams, and how, whether or not we get to pursue them, right? It's not a side issue. It's a very key issue that we cannot avoid engaging with. So, Comrade Manzi, welcome back to this session. I think I'll begin that question with you, actually. Why political education? We say we are equipping people with ideological tools to understand and transform society. Why is political education necessary?
Well, I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude at being back for yet another conversation. It's always exciting to engage with issues that we feel have gravitas and that are profound in their impact, in their meaning, in their implication for the future and the prospects and the survival, if we may put it bluntly, of Africa and peoples of African ancestry all over the world. So, to respond to your question, why political education is important. Political education, in my mind, brings to the forefront the concept of conscientization. And I think this is a term that we have used on this platform, and our listeners will continue to hear us mention in the future. And from, I would say, a Leninist Marxist school of thought, or even from a socialist philosophical foundation, conscientization presupposes that real freedom, real transformation of society is not just brought about by the elite. It's not just caused by some critical mass or vanguard of leaders that have been elevated above the broad majority of the population. It has to be done with everyone in tow, every hand, every shoulder, every head or brain has to participate, has to own the struggle. And so I think political education, therefore, is a method, it's a tool that bridges the gap that would exist between the different clusters and segments of society. And once you have all members of the society kind of reading from the same page and therefore sharing a value system, sharing objectives, aspiring towards the same goals, then the internal contradictions that could otherwise compromise the revolution, if we're to think in a socialist context, or that would stand in the way of bringing about change, if we're to think in a neutral context, would kind of be eliminated. And then you can focus on the broader external contradictions, which you can't control. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's an enabler. It's an enabler. Yeah,
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah, and I think that that's very important, right? That there is this idea that when we conscientize, we kind of democratize change, right? More people get involved because conscientization assumes that there are people whose level of awareness is not necessarily being raised because people are aware of what they are going through, right?
Yeah.
Conditions are very real. If you are going to bed hungry every day, or if you are eating a meal or two in a week, you're very well aware of your conditions, right? But just drawing those linkages, and I think you point this out, bringing people to a common register along which we can then mobilize and think about the best form of organization. And I always think about those questions of mobilization and organization as being also informed by a particular form of political education, right? Our diagnosis of society, where we've come from, where we are, and how we can move forward, and even where we need to go, right, will inform the forms of political organization that we employ or deploy to bring about the changes that we seek, right? And that is the task that, comrade, as you pointed out, at the Fourth Generation Initiative, we're committed to. So today, to go to it, we are considering a very important question, particularly in Uganda and Africa's, contemporary political history and political economy. And that's the question of the retreat to neoliberalism, or what many in ideological circles would call bourgeois pragmatism, right? And this is on the basis of, and this seems to be a trajectory, comrade, that a lot of revolutionary movements, or at least movements that draped themselves in that revolutionary garb and speech, that's a trajectory that they assumed, right? If you think about all across the continent, Zanu-PF in Zimbabwe, the ANC in South Africa, the NRM in Uganda, which is now the party that we have lived under for quite a while, and all across the continent, CCM in Tanzania, right? So there seems to be this trajectory that these movements follow, and we're going to anchor this discussion on a paper that was written by, I think, a British journalist called Liam Taylor, and he wrote it in a popular journal of African political economy, the Review of African Political Economy, and he titled it the 18th Brumaire of Yoweri Museveni. Now, people who are familiar with a similar text by Marx know where he got the idea of the 18th Brumaire from, right? Because Marx wrote a tract like that, the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte. And there's a very interesting, actually, to draw a connection, there's a very interesting line which is part of the preface of that text by Marx, which we'll go into in a bit. But just to set the stage and to have us going in this discussion, comrade, Liam Taylor argues that Museveni's NRM, emerged with a genuinely radical political economic program in the early 1980s, right? And land reform, anti-imperialism. Like when you watch the old videos of Museveni, you see him saying these things, right? You see this young man, radical, very austere, obviously takes to, the bush, fights a guerrilla struggle for, and leads a whole army, mobilizes people. Like, for all intents and purposes, what he does is remarkable, right? It may only be unremarkable to the international imagination because of how much African history can be sidelined sometimes. But to mobilize, for that long, to politicize that group of people, and to bring about what he brought about is radical with any sense of the imagination. So you see these ideas, mass democracy, the involvement of people. Now, maybe to just start at the basic level, can you, paint a picture of what Uganda looked like when Museveni went to the bush? Like, what were the material conditions that produced this radical program, this radical imagination of the direction that Uganda needed to take?
I would say I do not entirely agree with the thesis that Museveni was a transformative, genuinely radical revolutionary from the outset. And I think what he was, in my analysis, was a very lucky actor, who was opportunistic and took advantage of the prevailing socioeconomic conditions of the time.
Yeah.
What do I mean by this? The NRA declares war on the government of the day, on the Obote government in 1980, after the country has emerged from a decade of complete economic and social collapse under the Idi Amin military junta. So there is basically no infrastructure, both physical, but also soft, in terms of governance structures, in terms of morale among the population, in terms of hope for the future. So the UPC government in 1980 is not anything formidable to write home about in terms of how a small, so-called small guerrilla movement that started off with only 27 guns and about 100 men could eventually defeat them 8 years later. There was hardly no army to speak of. There was hardly no police force to speak of. The population was fragile, divided, fearful. The legitimacy of the new leader, of course, was strongly problematized by the history of the 1966 crisis, which had completely biased the biggest minority in central Uganda, that is the Buganda community, against the person of Obote, but also the political establishment of UPC. So basically what we had were real social, economic, political, and material conditions that made it easy for rebel groups to mushroom, which is why there were not just one, but several rebel groups all across the country, And of course, this was compounded by the fact that the heartland of Buganda was inimical. It was hostile to the central government, and that made it very easy for a guerrilla movement to find solace and hospitality within the local population, and so make an insurgency possible, like they were able to do for the 5 years in Luwero. So I feel that luck was on their side in terms of the timing and also reading the kind of the sociological mood in the country and saying this is a government that's very fragile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so, comrade, just to cut in there, because the way we characterize this is very key. There are enabling factors, right?
yeah,
There's what helps me, aids me in doing something, and then there is the motivating factors, right?
yeah.
So when we say that, or when you say that Museveni is a lucky actor, right? Are you speaking to the motivations of what took them to the bush in the first place? Because you say he's opportunistic, Like, was there a genuine need to take that route, or
Absolutely not.
you do not believe that there was a
Absolutely
need?
not.
Yes.
Museveni was not an outsider of the political
Mm,
establishment at the time.
yeah.
We all know that he had been working in the president's office right from the Obote I regime in
Mm,
1962, right at independence. He was employed in the government. Kicked out by Amin in 1971, he was very active in the exile community in Tanzania, and that's where he managed to go to Mozambique and gained some guerrilla experience through Frelimo's struggles. And he was part of many botched attempts to overthrow the Amin regime throughout the 70s. He was part of the um, transitional governments that ruled the country immediately after the exit of Amin up to the time the 1980 elections were held. In fact, I think he was number two in the country's political hierarchy as vice chairman of the military commission in 1980 that organized the election that he eventually disputed. So um, there is a plethora of literature and historical evidence that shows that Museveni was a saboteur. Instead of being a genuine revolutionary and a savior, he was instead an actor that was embedded in the system, understood its weaknesses, understood its contradictions, and very deliberately and strategically schemed to take advantage of those weaknesses in order to gain power. And as we have seen 40 years later, cling on to that power without using it to genuinely transform the society. So any revolutionary tendencies, any socialist, communist kind of rhetoric and leanings that were evident in the early days were merely a means to an end in my analysis. Yeah.
So you think it was just a gab to dress up other ulterior motives? But, comrade, just
Yeah.
in terms of, again, questioning motive, right? You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's one thing to go and organize a conference, to decry, to go and organize a walk to work, you know, to like Besige, to decry what the government is doing, or to organize a political campaign and say, you know, we don't want what was that tax that we had on social media, you know, we don't
Yeah.
want that tax, and then
OTP.
OTP, you know. But it's another thing altogether to go and mobilize people with the risk of your life, right? Unless you're just a romantic, you know, and you just don't like your life, you know. But it takes some kind of conviction to do that. Obviously, we know that with the transformation of society and with things like this, as Sankara urged, it always takes a certain amount of madness, you know. So inevitably that is involved. But it takes something to go and prosecute that for 5 years, to mobilize from scratch, you know. Can't we grant that at the very least there were genuine objectives that were being fought for, that the current system did not provide for, and that he rationalized, and we can take him at his rationale, because this is a general question that is cross-cutting across around the continent, right? It might not even just be for the Ugandan context, where I was talking with a friend, and I think we mentioned this earlier, that many people think that the NRM is the party that led Uganda to independence. Many people are not aware deeply of our history, but that's just because of the longevity of the party and the way that it paints its own political history, you know, in regards to other political formations that came before it, the Obote government, and all these other presidents that came before, right? But even at that, we can grant that say they had clear objectives, which they did. When you think about the 10-point program that they produced, you know, the advocacy for, you know, mass democracy, mass participation, the argument against sectarianism, which has been a leading one for the president, you know, that anti-imperialist stance, which he actually acted on when he came to power. If we grant their rationale, we still have to consider the question of why it moved from its initial position to the position that it later took on, right? The
Why
trial.
would you? Yeah.
Or, or,
I
or,
am
or, or, or,
curious.
do, or, do, or do you believe inherently that from the get-go, there were always national capitalists who were committed to neoliberalism from the start. You don't think
I
that
would
there was
say,
any commitment at all on the part of the NRM and the regime to genuine political and economic transformation in the country?
I
Like that
think
the
we
revolution did not simply get off rails, that it was never on that track in the first place.
absolutely. I think we would be well served to understand the genesis of the NRM as a political formation. The NRM was formed out of a merger. It was an institution created out of a political deal, a deal of political convenience between Museveni's UPM party and I think Yusuf Kironde Lule's formation. You know, there was a formation under Yusuf Kironde Lule, and the two decided to reach some kind of alliance because they understood that the politics of the country and the landscape on which that politics was organized was balkanized. So they needed to form an alliance against rather than an alliance for. What do I mean? They had a common enemy in the form of a northern dominated government embodied by Obote as a leader, but also embodied broader by Obote and Amin as his successor.
Yep.
So there was this kind of analysis of Ugandan society and Ugandan politics as bifurcated between North and South, between Nilot and Bantu.
Yeah.
And so Museveni, who had his political base in the West and Southwest, understood that an alliance with the central dominant community of Uganda and its surrounding smaller communities like Busoga and other Bantu groups in the east would make a very strong alliance in terms of building a practical political movement and recruiting combatants for their guerrilla army, but also in terms of appealing emotionally to the fears of northern domination of southern Bantu, but also the aspirations for power. Buganda, which had had a social contract, if we may say, with the British colonial government and therefore received special treatment all throughout the colonial period of Uganda, uh, felt aggrieved because they had been, in their mind, cheated of what was their natural right to Ugandan overlordship. And so this was a simmering grievance that he took advantage of, you know. And I think even in the modern context, we still see some of these aspirations and wishes embodied in, for example, the character of Chagulanyi as a presidential candidate from Buganda. Yeah.
Yeah. So, comrade, you see, there are things, again, two things that we have to disentangle here.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are tactics and strategy in prosecuting a revolution. Tactics and strategy attempting to take power. Right? We keep making the argument that Uganda's opposition is very, to again use your term, balkanized. These guys have never been able to cohere around an individual, and yet they are aware of the supremacy of the state, and that none of them can singly take on President Museveni, right? So there's the necessity of saying, okay, let us align ourselves and mobilize behind Echagulanyi or Ekiza Besigye, Dr. Besigye, for example. Now that's a different question from why are we doing this? You get it? The opposition in Uganda today can argue, okay, it's because we are living under a very brutal and corrupt regime, that is very repressive. So our struggle, as they have often framed it, would be around the human rights question, right? Would be around, the rights of Ugandans, would be around the fact that maybe they feel aggrieved that we're not developing and progressing at the pace that we should, and that the main culprits for that are the part of the political class that dominates the NRM, and our ruling coalition, essentially. But those two things are very different. So it's one thing to argue that the NRA had these conveniences, right, or had these factors that made Uganda ripe for such a revolutionary break, or for their guerrilla struggle that they prosecuted. But it's another to argue about what the aims of those struggle were in the first place. And also, we can use hindsight as well and say, okay, then when they came to power, what did they do, and what did they attempt to do? Now, we can argue and agree to disagree maybe about the aims of that struggle, right? About, was it personalist, or, as you might suggest, was it even sectarian in the first place? A sectarian struggle painted against sectarianism, because there are things that you have to contend with the realities of society. You have to mobilize. There has to be a revolutionary base. There has to be a group of people that you begin with, right? Though, of course, the NRM would argue that around the country they're able to mobilize people from broad swaths of society, and that is the basis upon which they would eventually justify the no party, the broad-based politics that they, introduced eventually. But I think we can take this rationale for the purpose of this discussion. We can assume, if we assumed even goodwill, because and why I want us to do this is because we want to consider the larger question of what a potential retreat was. Like, you can't deny, for example, the facts that when the NRM came to power, they attempted barter trade, right? You can't deny the fact that when they came to and you're jumping on this. But when they came to power, for example, they inherited, as you said, an economy that was in shambles, part of which obviously the war that they prosecuted contributed to, right? Inflation was sky high, our balance of trade was really poor. There was a lot of disorder in the country, essentially. A very weak state, as you pointed out, still various rebel movements that, the country needed to, those alternative centers of power needed to be eliminated, essentially, if we were to pursue any nationalist cause. And you can see in retrospect that there was marked improvement, right? From that position, from the balance sheet that they inherited in the early 80s, or in the late 80s when they took power, to, let's say, the early 2000s, and even where we are currently, right? You cannot say that Uganda is where it was in 1980. Like, that would just be very dishonest analysis, right? So can we at least assume the rationale to be able to apply this one case? Because what we're taking is Uganda as a case and I know it's a very particular characterization of a revolution that sort of not necessarily goes off track, but that is unable to fulfill the objectives that it set for itself. So what we're doing essentially would be taking these people at their own rhetoric and the way that they justified the revolution in the first place. Can we grant that? At the level
It
of
is
facts.
certainly, it is certainly dishonest to make a blanket statement
Yeah.
and completely discredit the NRM and claim absolute non-achievement and non-attainment of objectives. There has been, I think, some material progress, and there are tangible benefits that the NRM has managed to deliver in terms of social goods, in terms of increased access to welfare and a better standard of living for the average Ugandan. I would imagine the biggest and most conspicuous attainment, even when you speak to the man on the street in Kampala or Gulu or Kasese, would be the pacification of insurgencies all across the country so that people are not living under active war. And that is something that the Ugandan population has particularly been grateful to the NRM for, and any observer of Ugandan society will have to admit that. Now, the more important question for me would be, is the pacification that was achieved by the NRM the ability for Ugandans, as the colloquial saying is in Luganda, okweba kotulo, people can go to sleep at night, which is a very kind of vivid exemplification of how even the simple dignities of life were robbed from people during the period of tumult and constant insurgency all across the country. Is the achievement of that a reflection of a genuinely transformational agenda on the part of the NRA, or is it simply a consequence of the consolidation of power? Of course, any effective hegemonic state, whether it is transformative or not, will want to crush all armed threats to it and monopolize violence. That will be the interest of the state. So we cannot consider that an end in itself and as a reliable indicator of whether the state and those in charge of it are revolutionary and genuinely transformative. I think it is after they have crushed their opponents completely, silenced them and monopolized violence, what do they then do with the peace? That is the more reliable indicator of the nature and the intentions of a revolutionary movement. And if we were to look at the NRM scorecard, it is significantly and woefully underperforming. Yeah.
And at what point now you introduce again a very important, very critical distinction about what the preconditions for one's agenda are, right? And what their agenda itself is, right? That any kind of state, any serious group that wants to mobilize the society in any direction, it could be even for even if they're to remain in the system and they just want to loot the state, right? You need a certain amount of hegemony, as you've pointed out. You need some kind of control, hence the alliances, hence as we said, the elimination of alternative centers of power. And that they did, right? You can't, I think when you go on the street, many Ugandans will credit the NRM for bringing about peace and stability, right? That at least we are now in the point in our history whereby the biggest enemies of the people might be the state itself, right?
Absolutely.
When the state assumes or feels like the citizens who might disturb the peace, right? So
and if I could just make a quick addendum on this, you see the sinister way in which this monopoly of violence is then weaponized against the society. And there are two very vivid examples of this. The LRA insurgency in the north. There are many, many credible scholars and writers on Ugandan politics who have gone on the record as saying that the insurgency in the north of Uganda was deliberately prolonged by the NRM in order to completely eviscerate and hollow out the society. Because it could be cut off and isolated to a part of the country that had previously been a threat to the states and the monopoly of the new occupants of the state, because of the ethnic composition of that part of the country, and also the fact that they had a martial history. They had been dominant in the armed forces. So expose them to a civil war that will completely hollow out their population, that will traumatize them for generations to come, that will depopulate the part of the country, and that will cause these internecine kind of infighting that then balkanizes them further as a part of the country. And they managed to achieve that for a long
Yep.
time while making money from the international financial architecture that continues to, for humanitarian reasons, considerations, give you money to fight that insurgency. So, and then the second example would be what happened in Kasese and in the far southwest of the country. The fact that ADF is still an active fighting force in the Congo that occasionally makes incursions into Uganda, burns down schools, slaughters entire communities. That part of the country has historically also had a very strong anti-establishment tendency. There have been, attempts even to break away completely and form a separate republic, the so-called Yoweri Republic. So how do you punish them? Allow an insurgency that you could crush if you are, willing as a state. Allow it to blossom and then keep them on their toes.
So you think the NRM is deliberately holding back? The state is deliberately holding back from finishing off the enemies of the people in the West,
Yeah, the
just
ADF,
to
just like it
just to
did with LRA.
just to keep the region in check.
And also to keep its self-relevant, because it understands in the mind of a generation of Ugandans that have been alive for a long time. It's now, of course, an older generation, but perhaps those who are in their 40s and upwards, they still credit it primarily for restoring so-called peace.
Yeah.
So once you have this threat hanging over their head, then they will be cowed into supporting you ad infinitum.
That's
Yeah.
definitely quite a take on 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 the situation in Western Uganda and the situation in the north, right? But comrade, going back to the initial question, can we? The rhetoric of the government has not changed ever since, right? The rhetoric of the NRM and particularly its leader, the current president, has not changed. The question of socioeconomic transformation, right, of industrializing Uganda, of transforming society to a level that we can go toe to toe with the biggest economies in the world, but not necessarily toe to toe, because I don't think our nationalism has ever been aggressive. Our nationalism has always been defensive and progressive, right? We've always been thinking about, okay, how do we improve the lived conditions of our people? I am willing to grant that those were the aims of that formation, of that group, right? Even if it wasn't, you get to a point whereby if you are leading the country, you have to think in very national terms, right? And you have to think about, okay, how do we improve the lived conditions of people? How do we improve health? How do we improve infrastructure? How do we harness the resources that we have, to move the country forward? And even if we were just to grant it and say, okay, that is the aim, the rhetoric has not changed. The rhetoric around the imperative of, for example, Pan-African integration for the progress of the country, the imperative of, as it were, developing the factors of production, right? To ensure that we move forward as a country. Like when you read the president, when you read what these guys are saying, that rhetoric hasn't changed. That analysis of where society was and where it is right now hasn't changed. Obviously, it's a very rich analysis in the sense of it's convenient, right? You have to build your own movement. You have to have a certain there has to be some assumptions about what was before, and they try to justify their existence and the 5 years that they put Ugandans through on the basis of what was happening before. And you have to show somehow that the situation was so untenable that the existence of another political vehicle was justified. But I think one thing that we cannot dispute is where Uganda was and where Uganda needed to go. And they have articulated that vision very well. I always ask people, okay, particularly on the question of the armed struggle, if you assume right now that to move Uganda to the next level or to progress the country, we need to do another armed struggle. We need to mobilize against the state in an armed fashion. I always ask them, when you mobilize that way, do you have inherently different aims from what the state was pursuing? Even if you think it was just on paper. And I do not think that any Ugandan right now has different aims from what the NRM articulated as what they wanted to achieve with their revolution. If you think about what's, for example, in the Vision 2040 right now, we want to, most Ugandans are thinking in terms of modernization. We want to modernize the economy. If you ask them, you know this because you hear everyone in bureaucratic and policy circles. You ask them, what is the vision? Where are we trying to go? What are we pursuing? It will always be simple. Singapore. We've talked about this over and over again. From third world to first world. We all want to become first world countries. If you ask any African anywhere, that is their objective, right? We want to become a first world country. Obviously, we want to deal with some of the social malaise or modernity because we want to hold on some cultural aspects or in the cultural realm. So the objectives seem very clear, right? And so you have to grant that. But the question then becomes, why has the NRM been out, despite the rhetoric, despite what appears to be what is actually a very sound analysis of where society was in terms of the necessity of a strong state, one, two, the necessity of developing the factors of production that we had, our people, our land, our natural resources, benefiting those, and then in terms of also taking on this behemoth that we've called imperialism. Those were very clear aims in terms of advancing society socially as well, doing away with some of the social aspects of our culture that had held us back for some time, held back a section of society like women, held back different groups that had been marginalized. Those are objectives that you cannot argue with. So the question then becomes, despite the commitment, why were they unable to, or why have they up to now been unable to achieve some of these objectives that they set out in the first place?
Yeah, I would say it's like all things, a combination of factors. And to the best of my understanding, these are dividable into these two broad categories of internal and external. And external factors are largely beyond our control.
Yeah.
And we usually just have a situation in which we degenerate into sour graping and name calling rather than conceiving and conceptualizing of solutions. It is the internal factors that we have greater control over. And distasteful though it may be for me to personalize and kind of petrify the failure of Uganda, I am unfortunately left with no choice but to agree with those that have reduced the problem of Uganda in the last 40 years to a single individual, and that is the person of the president, General Museveni. And I think the fragility of small post-colonial states, such as Uganda, is such that the powers vested in the office and person of the presidency are so all-encompassing and they're so hegemonic that the behavior of that individual, the conduct of that individual, the personal whims and caprices of that individual, the personal shortcomings and the strengths of that individual have such an outsized impact on society.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the behavior personally of Museveni, you assess him as an actor on the Ugandan political stage from 1986 to date, you see that a lot of his deliberate choices, of his decisions, have been so instrumental in either registering progress or standing in the way of progress of the country. From the fight, against HIV/AIDS, for example, which is looked upon as one of the greatest accomplishments of the NRM government when compared against their peers on the continent and all across the world. The personal initiative of the president, his prioritization of things, his prioritization of that struggle, his charisma, at an individual level as a politician, was so instrumental in mobilizing the society to mitigate the spread of the virus and, thereby save millions of lives, both at the time and for future generations. You look at the struggle against corruption, which is one of the major cancers, at the heart of Uganda's political economy, state corruption, and then having it metastasize into the private sector. You start off with a state that is very deeply and fundamentally corrupt and therefore unable to be activist and to be developmental. Now, to circumvent that, you move into a market-led economy. You privatize everything because you declare how your own brother is a thief. Salim Saleh was involved in so many corruption scandals. Museveni himself, had to intervene several times to prevent him from being interdicted and jailed. And he understood that his entire crop of hangers-on and enablers were yes men who had been permitted to loot the state as a reward for their loyalty. And he says, okay, this group of people that I have cannot deliver economic transformation. Let's now privatize. But the moment you privatize, then you allow them also to participate in this new private, economy. And so you have this same mindset of corruption spreading into the private sector, stand in the way of development. 20, 30 years on, nothing. And then you look at, and these are my final thoughts on this, you look at the scheming that has gone into extending the presidential tenure each time. He has to compromise on the sternness and the principled kind of approach to politics that is necessary to deliver change, which may not, of course, be popular all the time. You have to make certain tough decisions that will anger certain constituencies in the short run, but benefit the country as a whole for the mid and long term. He has been unable to do that because his style is patronage and appeasement. Patronage and appeasement. Work with cultural leaders, work with religious leaders, work with corrupt but loyal cadres, and just compromise all sorts of principles and institutional frameworks that are necessary to modernize and deliver efficient growth within the economy, as long as these work towards allowing longevity for your own political power.
Okay, so comrade, to just to get this discussion to at least achieve this objective of us, characterizing the person of the president whom you've cited is very key. Like, we can't dismiss the role of Museveni. You just simply cannot, right? I think a good way to think about it would be think about CCM, and this will drive to the heart of the point that I've been attempting to push. Think about the CCM in Tanzania. For all intents and purposes, the person of Julius Nyerere is not in dispute. Nobody disputes and interestingly enough, Museveni always, attributes to mentorship to Nyerere. He's a figure that he looks up to, and everything. But Nyerere is a guy that is not in dispute. Like, you go to Tanzania, this guy is very idolized. Like, everybody knows Nyerere, People marched for the Arusha. I remember I was in Tanzania at some point and I went to one of the museums. People marched for the Arusha Declaration, right? People were all on board with, not all, but people, he had his own version of, trying to deliver this modern transformation that every African state is pursuing right now, without question, right? Like, nobody assumes even anything about the necessity of material progress and the form in which that is taking. So think about Nyerere. Everybody knew him, benevolent character, firm but very compassionate, right? Like, you can paint the picture of this guy in that sense, right? And he attempts in his own way to deliver material transformation to his society, and yet it ends up in the same place that Museveni ends up in, right, with his objective. So even if we fail to grant the President Museveni that, to say, he had his motives were always sinister from the start. He wanted to mobilize power. He just loved power, and maybe he just always was looking for a place to loot for his family and all of that. Now, if we didn't grant him that, but we can grant it to Nyerere at the very least, that the man wanted to mobilize for Tanzania. He wanted to move them from the point where they were to a more developed country, a country that is able to supply more, those material and social goods, as you pointed out, for their people. But we still have to face the facts that they all ended up in the same place, right? And the CCM has assumed a very NRM-esque character over the years, So all over the continent, the point that I've been trying to make is that despite the aims and despite the personal morality and even the political morality of entire projects that these people have represented, it seems that from a developmentalist standpoint, we've all always ended up in the same point. So the question is it just simply a question of internal factors, that the people who are leading these formations have failed their countries, and we must rightly blame them as and again, you've pointed out that as far as political economy is concerned, these things tend to be more complex. Or is it that there is something about the inherent nature of the societies, right? That, and the inherent nature of the situation in which we find ourselves, that has failed to enable us progress. If CCM, with a leader who is very well beloved, with a leader who has the heart of his people, right, who is even beloved even on the international stage, has landed in the same place with a deal from the IMF and all these international financial institutions that has landed this country in a certain point, that the CCM is taking on a certain character. If we go to South Africa, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, like, you can't even dispute that these guys have have their countries at heart. You go to the Samora Machels, in across the continent. I've been reading a lot on Cabral. He wasn't able to see the struggle through to this very end. I mean, his brother had to pick up from there after they betrayed him. But you look at the fact that they had these aims and they're only able to achieve so much. So is it a question of time? Because time is also a factor. Maybe what they have set in motion just hasn't had enough time to mature and materialize yet, or is that African countries are just young and we haven't had enough time? I'm partial to that perspective, that really these are nations still being built, right? Or is there something underlying in the structure and the history of these societies that inevitably gets them on the trajectory where they have ended up?
Wow, that's a very good summation. I think you touch on the heart of the solution, and that is the nexus between geopolitics and factors and dynamics that are shaping the world. The power play between the big powers the West versus the East, and how Africa is kind of trapped in between these two stampeding elephants, right from the time of the Cold War, you know, between the capitalist West and the socialist Soviets, to this modern, again, proxy war that we now have between the West in general and the Russo-Sino kind of alliance, and how Africa's agency is taken away from it, and it becomes instead a kind of an extension of the interests and the machinations of these two power blocks. So I think that is a very important phenomenon to be aware of, and it really places in a grand scheme and a global context how limited our capacity for influencing the broad direction in which our societies go, and I think this is a concept we have discussed on this platform before with Comrade Trevor articulating it quite clearly. Development by permission. Development by permission. So Africa seems to not yet have reached the stage as an entire landmass, taken together. The whole of Black Africa hasn't been given permission to develop by the great powers. It is still viewed and used as a site of primary extraction of resources, but also of labor in the form of, cheap, menial, low class, unskilled labor to the Gulf countries, and having, the few university educated and graduate population going to the West, and we know the very infamous trope about drowning of African youth in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic, crossing the oceans and trying to reach the greener pastures of Europe. So that broader kind of analysis allows you to appreciate why we have at scale, the problem at scale across the continent, irrespective of the particularities and the idiosyncrasies and the nuances within each of the states and each of the territories. But of course, if we zoom in, then despite this kind of universal, generic external environment that keeps us limited to progress and agency within a particular range of the spectrum, so that even if you have someone as idealistic and as far-sighted and as intellectually competent as Nyerere on the one hand, or you have someone as bungling and inept and completely self-serving as Mobutu Sese Seko, or Kamuzu Banda of Malawi on the other hand, their countries will still lie within the same bracket, the same range of the developmental spectrum. And I think Nyerere himself has articulated this very well. If one may refer to a speech he gave in the Ugandan parliament, I believe it was in 1988 or 87, late 80s, shortly after the NRA had captured the Ugandan state. He was invited to address a session of the Ugandan parliament with Besigye and Museveni in attendance. And he talks about he had recently retired from the Tanzanian presidency, and now he was, viewed as an elder statesman from the global south, just traveling around the world and explaining his own failures and giving advice. Giving advice to the new crop, And he said, we are just clans. We are clans, and clans cannot take on empires. Yeah, he says, yes, I was president of Tanzania for 20 something years. And we had a flag, we had an anthem. People saluted me. But when I went to meet Reagan, I was just an ant. Like I was as small as I was a non sequitur, So Africans are clans, and they have to understand that you cannot take on empires as clans.
Yeah.
We are just playing games, really. He really he watered down this whole concept of executive power and so-called state trappings in these little countries of ours.
Yeah.
And so that is a very significant factor. It is perhaps 80% of the problem, I dare say. Now, the 20% of the problem is the internal factors.
Yeah.
And I think while they may be small in magnitude, they are consequential in their importance. The Tanzanian state, for example, at its core, is still a more durable political society, at least in the medium term, than the Ugandan state. The Ugandan state, unfortunately, as a result of the NRM's machinations and its operationalization of state authority and state capture, has made Uganda a potential failed state in the mold of Somalia, in the future, in the near future, in the foreseeable future. You speak to the ordinary Ugandan. There is this existential fear that Ugandans harbor, and they know it, a worry that is hard to put your finger on.
There's a specter that's always looming on people's heads
that's
about
just
what
hovering
happens
over our heads because we are so uncertain about transition, not just because, there is going to be a contestation among the elites for power, but also we are uncertain of whether the center will hold and Uganda as an imagination, as a political society, will survive. The exit of Museveni. And I think it is Charles Onyango that has articulated this most eloquently of late. He says we are likely to balkanize, highly likely. And someone like Charles Onyango, who has been a close observer and a commentator on regional and East African affairs, he is not someone whose opinion can easily be dismissed.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I love that you brought back Olemo, right? Because I watched that clip as well. And Olemo is an interesting character. Just as we close this discussion for today, he's an interesting character because you see his opinions even on the necessity of Pan-African integration change. I think he begins by assuming, not assuming the worst necessarily, but taking the opposite view to Nkrumah about the urgency of integration in the immediate post-independence period when African countries got there. And I think he had a radical view. I mean, he was more partial towards the East African community, right? Hence, you recall the history around how he wanted to delay the independence of Tanzania just so everyone could get independence together. So he had glimpses of it, but he did not, I think, at that point appreciate the necessity of all these countries, when Nkrumah was preaching about, integration and the whole Casablancan business. But at the end,
he accused Nkrumah of being a Napoleon, actually.
So all of them thought they really ascribed the worst of intentions to him, right, when he was speaking about integration. But then there's an article.
Except, and as Ugandans, we need to take pride in this, except Obote. Only Obote voted for an immediate union of African states in 1963.
That's important to note.
Yes.
Yeah. So he writes then an article, Nyerere, I think in the late 80s, still around that period. He goes to Ghana. And then I think he did a lot of apology tours at that time after he left power. So he tells them that, guys, really, I was wrong. Nkrumah was right all along, right? And that is very telling, because you talk to young Africans today and you tell them, like, we need to really give some serious thought to this question of Pan-African integration to deal with the age-old problem of balkanization and the age-old problem of imperialism and the age-old problem of our security and our future. And this has remained, you have to give it to him as well, this has remained a constant refrain by the president, by President Museveni, that is, that, guys, we need to consider the question of our security seriously. Obviously, he has also, in a way, used it as a way to justify his continued stay in power. He's not going to realize it in his lifetime, for sure. So that cannot be a justification for a continued stay of an individual in power.
Yeah,
But
if I may just quickly comment on that before you move on to another subject. I think the hypocrisy with which Museveni has kind of articulated his Pan-African grandiosity, but also the contradiction of his actions, of his government's actions in creating an enabling environment for Pan-Africanism is something really interesting. Because on the one hand, his rhetoric is so reminiscent of proper Pan-Africanist ideology, but his action, if, for example, we are to take the weaponization of the UPDF as a mercenary army that has contributed to just destabilization of neighboring countries, unilateral intervention in different regional neighboring states, the latest of which is South Sudan, where the UPDF is now being accused of committing ethnic kind of cleansing against the Nuer population. They are intervening in that civil war and taking sides clearly, and then being used as the head of the hammer by Salva Kiir's government to brutalize Riek Machar's community, the Nuer. Same thing with the UPDF being accused of war crimes in the Congo. In the 2007 post-election violence in Kenya, they were accused of having gone and committed atrocities against the Luo, community there. They are all over the place in Somalia. They've still been accused of committing atrocities and being, in a way, this tool of Western proxy interests in the Great Lakes region. Yeah. That's just
that's definitely very important to point out. Mapping the man's ideological commitments and analysis, which is sound, but with the actions that have been taken. Also, it's important to point out in that line that I don't think he's committed to a larger Pan-African, in the sense of continental, project of unity, as much as he's committed to a more regionalist approach, But the point being that Mwalimu, at the end of his time, he realized that there's only so much you can achieve by goodwill and national reform alone. There's a lecture that we'll probably share with the people following the conversation, which was done by Dr. Lwazi Lushaba of the University of Cape Town, on the pitfalls of national reform. He talks about Fanon, and he talks about just the limits of nationalism, particularly in this capitalist dispensation in which we exist in, whereby, our countries, as you already pointed out, we're still at the periphery, right? So there are limits to that, and there are people who have already experimented nationally, that we don't need another leader who does not have an appreciation of this history to come in and then face the same dynamics and then come and cry again and say, oh, guys, we tried, but then we failed here. So I think that appreciation of history is key, and why we do this work at the fourth generation, right? Now let's look at history. History is a very good laboratory, right? If you're thinking about experiment, history is a very good laboratory. It tells you what is possible. So the next time that you see an actor who is saying the same things, you can know that this one has not read, or this one has, this one did not do this experiment, sparing society from other years of, again, repeating the same things, doing the same thing, expecting different results. But just to bring the discussion back and try and close it, comrade. So there's that appreciation of, yes, the necessity of Pan-African integration as a way to mitigate the external. But you point out that we have the internal factors that we actually have to deal with, and that we have the agency over. To borrow from this self-development literature, people say that there are things within your area of concern and area of influence, right? There are things that are within your sphere of concern. You don't really influence it much. They could come and pick up Museveni in the night like they did this man. Maybe it would be hard, I don't know, but they could pick him up from State House like they picked up
Maduro.
they picked up Maduro, and that just takes the cut. Like your fate is determined by somebody else. But so that's external, right? When the president complains, for example, about our inability to attract investment, our inability to have people invest, seriously in our countries without just speculating, like those are real things, right? But I think you point out that there are things that are within our area of our sphere of influence. There are things that we can work on as a country internally. How we arrange ourselves, what mode we choose to reward people, how we employ people, how we incentivize performance in the bureaucracy and within the civil service, and even at a local level. Like those are things that are within our control as a society, and we cannot necessarily blame imperialism for it. There are things that are cross-cutting, obviously. People still want to influence even the internal, because I don't think imperialism is that limited.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But so I think for the next discussion, definitely, comrade, would do a deeper dive into the specificities of the NRM, right, and of how they prosecuted their revolution, how Museveni has over time managed to as well, mobilize, how he has navigated global dynamics, because that's very important, right? How he has his experience as a historical actor is very key. Even if he leaves the stage tomorrow, we still have to seriously consider him and study him as somebody who had these ideological commitments and attempted to, take on the international stage in a certain way. So his experience will always be very key for us. So, comrade, we'll stop here for today, but we'll allow room for any parting comments, anything from today's discussion.
No, I would say I'm excited to dive deeper in terms of navigating possible solutions out of this swampland we find ourselves mired in.
All right. Thank you very much. So we'll keep the conversations going on the Fourth Generation Initiative. The commitment remains the same. Let's equip ourselves. Let's understand our societies as a critical step, to bringing in transformation. Right? It remains an error if we don't take the study of society seriously. Because as we've seen, the only place where that lands us is that we can only transform society by accident. We'll always keep repeating the same things that have been done over and over again. So we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our children, future generations, to educate ourselves politically, so as to think our way, but also to act our way out of our present reality. Because we can't deny that society needs to change and that our lives need to get better. So we can follow the conversations that are happening, the Fourth Generation Initiative, all our platforms, our blog, our YouTube, and Conscientize as well, which is a new podcast that we have now, which will feature the audio versions of all the conversations that we have here. Follow the conversations. Follow us on Instagram, on YouTube, and TikTok, I believe as well. That's where young people are nowadays. So we'll be there, And we, as always, covet your engagement. So engage. Let's ask questions. Let's engage. And till then, let's remain committed to that task. See you then.